Have you ever felt your brain just straining? You know that moment when you're trying to hold on to a sequence of numbers or maybe juggle instructions for something new, or even wrestle with a problem that feels like, I don't know, trying to lift weights with your mind?
Oh,
That
absolutely.
palpable sense of mental effort, the feeling that your brain is really working hard?
Yeah, that's a really common experience, that feeling of cognitive strain. We all hit it, maybe learning something new or
Mm.
trying to resist a distraction
Right.
or just keeping multiple things in your head at once. But yeah, often we just feel it. We don't really stop to think about what's actually happening inside our heads to make that feeling.
Exactly. And that feeling, that state of intense mental effort, that's precisely what we're diving into today. We've got our usual stack of sources, but the core of this deep dive comes from, a really fascinating chapter 2, titled Attention and Effort. It's from a really foundational book on how we think. And it kind of cracks open the hood, gives us a window into the actual mechanics of mental effort, how our minds manage their limited, energy.
Yeah, and what happens when that energy gets pushed to its absolute limits?
Right.
This chapter is so crucial because it really moves beyond just describing thinking. It tries to uh, quantify and observe the cost of thinking, especially that deliberate, effortful kind.
Hard stuff.
Exactly. It gives us this framework for understanding cognitive load,
Hmm.
how much our minds can actually handle at any given moment.
Yeah.
And it introduces this idea that attention isn't just like a spotlight.
Right.
It's something that involves a real, measurable use of mental resources,
Hmm.
like spending energy.
Okay, so our mission today, using these sources, is really to unpack the nature of that mental effort. We
Hmm.
want to understand the different systems, the systems at play in our thinking that handle this effort, and discover, maybe most surprisingly, a remarkably simple but kind of profound, physical, visible way scientists have actually managed to measure this internal invisible effort.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
I mean, measuring thinking physically, that sounds like something straight out of science fiction, right? And honestly, I'm really excited to get into the clever, almost charmingly low-tech research methods they used to do it.
It really is a brilliant piece of research described in the source.
Yeah.
Just elegantly simple in its core idea,
Hmm.
but profound in what it tells us about, the inner workings of our minds.
Yeah.
It takes effort from being just this abstract idea to something tangible.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We really have to start with the basic distinction the source makes. It introduces what you could think of as the dynamic duo, or maybe more accurately, the intuitive lead and the effortful supporting character of our cognitive processes.
Right.
These two systems our minds use to think.
Exactly. The book uses this neat narrative analogy. It casts System 2 as the supporting character. But, and this is a really key detail, it describes System 2 as a supporting character who believes she's the hero of the story.
Huh. Okay. So what does that tell us?
Well, right away, it tells us that System 2 feels like us. It's where we experience our conscious decisions, our deliberate thoughts, that feeling of agency.
Right, the me thinking.
Exactly. Even though, as the source makes really clear, it's often guided and influenced by the other one, the more automatic System 1.
And the absolute defining feature of this system, too, according to the source material, the thing that sets it apart.
That its operations are effortful.
Effortful.
That's the crucial distinction. Thinking with System 2 takes mental energy. It actually requires work.
Right.
And interestingly, one of the main characteristics the source gives System 2 is a tendency towards laziness.
Laziness. Like it doesn't want to work.
Well, yeah, but it's not meant like a moral failing. It's more a description of how it prefers to operate. System 2 is apparently reluctant to invest more effort than is strictly necessary for any task. It prefers, comfort over strain.
Okay, so even though System 2 feels like the conscious captain is steering the ship,
Hmm.
its natural inclination is to save that precious mental energy. And because of this sort of inherent laziness, this preference for the path of least resistance,
Right.
its choices and actions are often started or heavily guided by the other system, System 1.
Exactly. System 1 is described as the figure at the center of the story. It operates automatically, really quickly, intuitively.
Without that feeling of effort.
Precisely. No effort involved. And while System 1 isn't the main focus of this specific chapter, its constant influence is always there in the background. System 2 typically only fully engages, takes over control. When System 1's quick, intuitive answers aren't enough.
Like when it hits a problem, it can't solve automatically.
Yeah. Or when System 1's initial impulse or suggestion needs to be overridden, like, hold on, that doesn't seem right.
And that's where System Two's absolutely vital role comes in.
Yeah.
It does the tasks that only it can do precisely because they demand that conscious effort.
Right.
These are the things that require deliberate attention, complex calculations, following specific rules.
And crucially, acts of self-control.
Yeah.
Overriding those immediate gut feelings, impulses, habits that System 1 is constantly throwing up.
Like thinking through a tricky logic puzzle or resisting the urge to grab that second cookie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or solving a complex math problem, or trying to focus in a noisy room that's System 2 in the driver's seat, expending effort.
Okay.
This basic distinction, between the effortless automatic System 1 and the effortful deliberate System 2 really helps us connect with our own everyday experience. It's powerful.
How so?
Well, think about your day. When do you feel your brain really working hard? It's usually when you're tackling something new, right? Or something complex.
Yeah.
Something that requires careful thought, or maybe resisting a big distraction. That's your System 2, activating its resources, burning that energy.
And conversely, when are you on autopilot?
Right. Driving a familiar route, brushing your teeth, maybe having a simple routine conversation. A lot of that is handled effortlessly by System 1. The source just frames it beautifully, gives us a language for these different ways our brain works.
It really does provide a framework for understanding those different internal states we feel. And to really feel what System 2 working at, like full tilt, is like, the source suggests a specific exercise, one they actually used in their research.
Oh, yes.
They call it the Add One Challenge.
The Add One task. Yeah, it sounds deceptively simple, doesn't it?
It does.
But it's designed specifically to push your cognitive limits really quickly and let you palpably feel that sensation of effort.
Okay, so how does it work, the setup?
The setup, as the source describes it, it's pretty straightforward. You create a few 4-digit strings, make sure all the digits within each string are different. That's important.
Like 5294.
Exactly. You could write each string on a separate card or something. Then you need to get a steady rhythm going. The researchers used a metronome, clicking at 1 beat per second.
Okay, 1 beat per second.
And that's crucial. It paces the task and adds, a bit of pressure.
So how do you do the task itself?
Right. You read the 4 digits aloud, say 5294, on consecutive beats. Then you wait for 2 beats of the metronome. Just pause.
Oh, yeah, 2-beat pause.
And after those 2 beats, you have to report a new string where each original digit has been incremented by 1. So your 5294 becomes...
That's 633 6305.
Exactly. 6305.
Yeah.
And you have to maintain that steady rhythm throughout and do the transformation entirely in your head.
Okay, yeah, just doing that one, keeping that steady pace, 1 beat per second while doing the math. I can feel how that adds to the demand. The source notes that very few people can comfortably handle doing this add one task with more than 4 digits. Just trying it in your head now with 5294, transforming it to 6305 while keeping time. You can already feel that focus narrowing, right? That sense of effort starting.
It absolutely demands focused attention, and you're actively manipulating information in your working memory. It's not passive.
And the source mentions they could turn up the heat even more.
Oh, yeah. The add 3 task, incrementing each digit by 3.
Oof. Okay, that sounds significantly harder.
It is an even harder challenge, designed to push those cognitive limits even closer to their breaking point.
So the point of trying these, or even just imagining them, is to show how intensely effortful some cognitive tasks really are.
Exactly. The source makes the point that even if you, quote, think for a living.
Right, even if your job involves complex stuff.
Yeah, complex analysis, problem solving.
Yeah.
You might still be surprised by how quickly these simple-sounding arithmetic transformation tasks demand all of your attention and effort. They're built precisely to stop you from just slipping into that System 1 autopilot.
Because they require deliberate attention, holding and manipulating multiple things in working memory at the same time.
And applying a specific rule under time pressure. All those core System 2 operations that just consume significant cognitive resources. It's a really pure way to observe effort in action.
And speaking of observing effort, this is where the story gets really fascinating. It introduces that surprisingly physical way scientists figured out how to measure this invisible process.
Yeah.
The sources describe being inspired by an older article and this concept of the eye's pupil as a kind of window to the soul.
Yes, this whole line of research was apparently kicked off, or at least heavily inspired, by a Scientific American article written by a psychologist named Eckhart Hess.
Hess, okay.
And Hess reported that his wife had noticed his pupils widening when he was looking at particularly beautiful nature pictures. Just an observation.
Interesting.
But it sparked his curiosity, about the connection between our internal states and the size of our pupils.
And the sources dig into some anecdotes related to this, right? Like comparing pictures of the same woman.
Yeah, they mentioned Hess did experiments showing people pictures, and he saw this effect,
Yeah.
including, that striking comparison of photos of the same woman. She apparently appeared more attractive in the one where her pupils were artificially dilated.
So there's some aesthetic preference linked to pupil size.
Seems like it, and it's
Yeah.
not just a modern scientific thing. The connection has a history. They mentioned belladonna,
Oh, yeah, the plant extract.
right, used for centuries as a cosmetic by women specifically to dilate their pupils because larger pupils were seen as more attractive. And there's that anecdote about bizarre shoppers.
In the Middle East, wearing dark glasses.
Exactly. To hide their level of interest from merchants who were trying to gauge how much they wanted something by looking at their eyes, seeing if their pupils widened.
Okay, so there was this existing idea. Pupils change with interest, emotion, arousal. But Hess found something different, something crucial that really grabbed the attention of the researchers behind our main source.
Yes, this was the key breakthrough. He observed that pupils weren't just sensitive to general emotional arousal or interest. They were also incredibly sensitive indicators, specifically of mental effort.
Mental effort, not just emotion.
Exactly. That was the crucial distinction. Hess had collected evidence showing this. He found people's pupils would dilate quite substantially when they were doing mentally demanding tasks,
Mhm.
like multiplying two-digit numbers in their head.
Okay.
And, even more importantly, he showed that they dilated more if the problems were hard compared to if they were easy.
Ah, so it scaled with difficulty.
Precisely. That strongly suggested the dilation wasn't just about, paying attention or feeling a bit stressed. It seemed to be a physiological response directly tied to the cognitive load, the amount of deliberate effort being used.
Wow. So this idea of a visible physical sign of mental effort, a way to actually see how hard someone's brain is working from the outside.
Yeah,
Even though it wasn't directly related to the hypnosis research the author was involved in at the time, it must have seemed incredibly promising, a whole new research avenue.
exactly. It offered a path to get beyond just asking people, how hard was that? You could actually measure it.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating here is the elegance, the simplicity of it. Using such a basic, readily available physiological measure of pupil size to track these complex and visible internal cognitive states.
You didn't need fancy brain scanners, not initially anyway.
Right. It's just a beautiful example of scientific ingenuity and careful observation leading to a really powerful method.
Absolutely. And this is where the collaboration mentioned in the source comes in. Jackson Beatty, who was a graduate student then, shared the author's excitement about this pupil idea, and they decided to build their own research setup to really dig into it systematically.
Yeah, they designed and built this lab environment. The source description makes it sound a bit like going to the opticians.
How so?
Well, the participant would sit with their head resting securely on a chin and forehead rest, to keep it stable,
Okay.
staring forward at a camera lens. And they'd listen to pre-recorded information or instructions through headphones, doing these tasks, often paced by the metronome beats.
And the tech they used to measure the pupils,
Yeah,
it sounds almost quaint now, right? Analog.
totally. An infrared flash would fire every second, apparently too dim for the participant to notice,
Okay.
but bright enough to trigger a picture being taken of the participant's eye once per second.
And then they had to process the film.
Yeah, the measurement process sounds like it involved a bit of manual labor back then.
Uh-huh.
The researchers would literally rush to get the film developed after a session,
Right.
project the images of the pupil onto a screen, and then use a ruler to measure the diameter or area of the pupil frame by frame.
Wow. But despite that manual part, the source says this method was a perfect fit for young and patient researchers. Why was that?
Because they knew their results almost immediately after developing the film.
Instant gratification, relatively speaking.
Exactly. The pattern of dilation or contraction was right there, visible to the naked eye. And the data, apparently, always told a clear story. They didn't have to wait weeks for complex statistical number crunching. The signal was strong and clear from the raw measurements.
Okay.
And this immediacy, combined with the precision of the measurement, is why those paced tasks like add 1 and add 3 were just perfect for their work.
Because they knew exactly what was happening when.
Precisely. By having the participant do these demanding tasks to a strict, timed rhythm, repeating digits on specific beats, transforming them within a defined pause, they knew with pretty high confidence exactly what the subject was thinking or experiencing mentally at any given second.
They could sync the external actions, hearing a digit, saying a digit, the
Hmm.
pause with the internal stuff like encoding, holding, transforming, retrieving.
All while measuring that physical pupil response, second by second. It was a way to externalize and precisely time the internal cognitive effort, making it observable and quantifiable through the pupil, really pioneering psychophysiology for cognition back then.
So what did they actually find? What was the pattern they saw by measuring pupil size second by second during these paced tasks?
Well, they discovered this really consistent dynamic pattern. They were basically mapping the ebb and flow of mental effort over time. Yeah, they found that pupil size wasn't static at all. It varied dramatically, minute by minute, even second by second. And these changes directly reflected the changing cognitive demands of the task being performed. As the task got harder in a specific moment.
The pupil got larger.
Exactly. And this pattern had a very distinct shape when they saw over and over again. They described it as an inverted V.
An inverted V. Okay, what does that look like in terms of the task?
All right, let's take the add 1 or add 3 task.
Hmm?
As the sequence of digits was presented, one by one, the subject has to encode and hold each one in working memory, right?
Right.
So with every added digit they hear, the mental load increases. And correspondingly, the pupil size, the effort, builds up. It climbs the side of that V.
Okay, building up.
Then it reaches what the source calls an almost intolerable peak.
The top of the inverted V.
Exactly. During and immediately after that short pause, that crucial window where the subject has to apply the rule, add 1 or 3 to each digit, while still holding the original string, and get ready to report the new string. That's peak effort.
So the peak isn't just hearing the last digit, it's the active transformation and preparation phase.
Precisely. And then, as the subject reports, the transformed string essentially unloading the information from their short-term memory by saying it aloud.
The effort drops off.
Yeah, the effort relaxes gradually, and the pupil contracts back down towards its baseline, completing the inverted V shape.
And this striking pattern, this inverted V of pupil dilation, it matched what people felt.
That's what they noted, yeah. It corresponded precisely to subjective experience. The subjects felt the strain building, hitting a maximum right before and during their response, and then feeling it subsides. The pupil provided this objective, physical measure of that internal feeling.
Wow.
And they gathered specific data that really backed this up. Longer strings of digits, they reliably caused larger maximum dilations than shorter strings because the memory load was higher.
Makes sense.
The transformation task itself, applying the add 1 or add 3 rule, added significantly more effort compared to just remembering the same number of digits.
Right, the processing is costly.
Definitely. And as you said, the peak of the pupil size graph lined up exactly with when participants reported feeling the maximum subjective effort during that pause and transformation stage.
They offered some concrete comparisons too, right, to really show the effort involved.
Yeah, they did. Performing the add 1 task with just 4 digits caused a larger pupil dilation than simply holding 7 digits in memory for immediate recall without any transformation.
7 digits. So add 1 with 4 is harder than just remembering 7.
According to the pupils, yes, it vividly highlights that the process of applying a rule and transforming information is significantly more effortful than just passively storing more data.
And what about add 3? That really tough one.
Add 3. The source describes it as the most demanding task they ever observed in their lab.
How demanding.
In the first 5 seconds of an add 3 trial, the participant's pupil could dilate by about 50% of its original area.
50%. That's a massive physiological change, just from a few seconds of mental arithmetic.
It really is.
Yeah.
And they also noted a corresponding increase in heart rate alongside the pupil dilation, about 7 beats per minute higher in those first 5 seconds for add 3.
So multiple physiological systems showing the strain.
Exactly. This convergence pupil dilation, heart rate increase, just reinforced how incredibly taxing the task was.
Mm-hmm.
They describe this level of effort as basically as hard as people can work, implying that trying to push consistently beyond this often leads to errors or people just giving up.
And did they see that limit reflected in the pupil data itself? Like, what happens when it's just too much?
They did. When they gave subjects sequences of digits that were simply too long for them to hold in memory, pushing them into cognitive overload,
Yeah.
their pupils didn't just stop dilating at the peak. Sometimes they would even shrink before the task was even finished.
Shrink, like they
Yeah.
just gave up.
Exactly. It indicated that the cognitive system had essentially disengaged from the impossible task. It couldn't sustain that level of futile effort.
Wow, okay. Think about tasks you find mentally taxing. Grappling with a really dense piece of writing or trying to follow super complex instructions or juggling multiple demands under a tight deadline.
Hmm.
Does that pattern resonate? That feeling of effort, building as you take in information, hitting a peak when you have to synthesize or decide or produce something, and then relaxing once the immediate demand is over.
Yeah, the people data strongly suggest this inverted V pattern of cognitive effort is pretty universal physiological response. It's like your brain's energy meter, visible from the outside.
It's absolutely incredible they could map that internal feeling of strain to such a clear external physical response. And they didn't just use this for the formal experiments, right? The lab setup itself became kind of a source of insight.
Yeah, and even some amusement, it sounds like. They worked in this spacious basement suite, and they had this clever setup. A closed-circuit TV system was rigged to project a large image of the subject's pupil,
How large?
about a foot wide, apparently, projected onto a screen that was located outside the lab, in the corridor.
So anyone walking by could see this giant projected eye and hear what was going on inside.
Exactly. You could hear the metronome, the subject speaking, and watching this enormous pupil dilate and contract in real time while the participant was working away on a task. The source says it was a fascinating sight and quite an attraction for visitors.
I bet. Like cognitive science performance art.
Right. And they turned this into a kind of party trick or demonstration. They amused themselves and, probably impressed guests by being able to tell the exact moment a participant had given up on a task, even without being in the room.
How could they tell that from the corridor?
Well, they observed that during a task like mental multiplication, the participant's pupil would typically dilate pretty large within a few seconds as they got into the problem.
Okay, big people working hard.
Right. And it would stay large, indicating sustained high effort, as long as the person was actively crunching the numbers.
Oh.
But the moment they arrived at a solution or just gave up because they were stuck or overloaded,
The pupil changed.
it contracted immediately and noticeably. Pop! Back down.
So they could be out in the corridor watching the giant pupil on the screen and know the instant the person inside stopped trying or finished the problem.
Right.
That's amazing.
Exactly. They'd sometimes apparently surprise participants and guests by calling out from the corridor, why did you stop working just now?
And the person inside would be like, how did you know?
Right. Astonished. And the researchers' dramatic, but actually pretty accurate response was apparently, we have a window to your soul.
Ha! Fantastic.
It's a great anecdote, and it perfectly captures the power of what they were observing. And the source makes a really valuable point for any researcher, actually,
Which is?
that these casual observations from the corridor, just watching the phenomenon unfold in real time, were sometimes as informative and generated as much intuition as the formal, structured experiments. There's real value in just watching the data react.
Yeah, that qualitative feel for it, which actually leads to another significant discovery, or maybe more like a crucial insight, that came from one of those informal moments.
Right. The author was apparently just idly watching a woman's pupil during a break between the formal tasks.
She was still on the chin rest.
Yeah, so he had a clear view of her eye, but she was just having a routine conversation with the experimenter, just chatting casually.
Okay. And what did he see? Or not see?
Exactly. He was struck by what he didn't see. Her pupil stayed small. It didn't noticeably dilate as she talked and listened. Totally different from the huge dilations they saw during their effortful tasks.
Ah, so casual conversation, not much effort.
Apparently very little or no significant cognitive effort, nowhere near the level of the add 1 or add 3 task they'd been studying. The source says it felt like maybe retaining 2 or 3 digits in memory. Just a minuscule demand compared to that add 3 sprint.
Okay, so that observation, that contrast, was a bit of a eureka moment.
Seems like it, yeah, because it really highlighted that the tasks they had deliberately chosen to study, add 1, add 3, complex mental math, were exceptionally effortful precisely because they were designed that way.
They weren't typical of most daily mental activity.
Exactly. And that's where that powerful, really useful analogy came from.
The walking analogy.
Yes, mental life, or more specifically, the life of System 2, is normally conducted at the pace of a comfortable walk. Most of our thinking, even when we're focused, isn't a flat-out sprint.
Okay, a comfortable walk.
And that walk is sometimes interrupted by episodes of jogging. When things require a bit more attention, a slightly faster pace of processing, like doing a simple calculation or recalling some specific information.
A mental jog.
Right. And only on rare occasions, like those specially designed add 1 or add 3 exercises, does it involve a frantic sprint. Casual chatting, like that break time observation, is just a stroll.
That analogy really helps calibrate things, doesn't it? While System 2 can put in immense effort to sprint, most of the time it's just cruising along.
Exactly. The demanding tasks that push it to its absolute limits are really outliers, not the norm, even for people whose jobs involve a lot of thinking. The source emphasizes that this comfortable pace is the default setting.
But pushing System 2 to that sprint level, to that peak of the inverted V effort curve, it comes at a significant cost, right? Beyond just feeling tired.
It does. The sources talk about this phenomenon they observed linked to intense effort, something you could call effortful blindness.
Effortful blindness. Okay, what's that?
It refers to the finding that when you are engaged in really intense mental effort focused on one task, you can become effectively blind to other things happening at the same time, even things that are physically right there in front of your eyes.
It sounds a lot like the famous invisible gorilla study.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a classic example. Participants counting basketball passes were so focused on that one task, they completely missed a person in a gorilla suit walking right through the scene.
They were kept so intensely busy with the counting.
Right. That intense focus seemed to just make them blind to the unexpected. And their research provided a similar, though maybe less dramatic example of blindness, using the add one task they'd perfected.
Okay, how did they test that?
While subjects were doing the add one, focusing intensely on the digits and the math, they were also shown a series of rapidly flashing letters on the screen, right in front of them.
Okay, letters flashing while doing add one.
And participants were explicitly told, give the digit task complete priority. That's the main goal. But they also had a secondary task report if the letter K appeared at any time during that 10-second trial while they were doing the add one.
Okay, prioritize digits, but also look for K.
Right. And the main finding was striking. It clearly showed this effortful blindness. The subject's ability to spot the K changed dramatically over the course of the add one exercise, and it directly correlated with their cognitive effort.
How so?
They almost never missed a K if it was shown right at the very beginning or near the very end of the 10 seconds, when the add one task was just starting or just finishing, and effort was relatively low.
Okay, easy to see it then.
But they missed the target letter, the K, almost half the time when their mental effort on the add one task was at its absolute peak right during that core transformation phase.
Wow, half the time, even though they were staring right at the screen where it flashed.
Exactly. The intense focus on the primary task, the digits, made them effectively blind to the secondary stimulus, the K.
And did this pattern of missing the K match the pupil pattern?
Perfectly. These failures of detection followed the exact same inverted V pattern as the dilating pupil. As the effort for add one built to its peak, detection of the K plummeted. As the effort for add one relaxed after the response, detection of the K improved again.
Okay, that symmetry between the pupil response and the detection failures, that must have been really reassuring for the researchers.
Absolutely. It strongly confirmed that the pupil was indeed a good measure of, yes, the physical arousal, but more importantly, the cognitive load accompanying mental effort. It validated their method for understanding how the mind works under pressure.
And it shows that intense focus really demands resources that are then drawn away from other things you might otherwise notice.
Precisely. It demonstrates a critical aspect of how System 2 operates when the load is high. It prioritizes. When the demand gets intense, it has this sophisticated mechanism for focusing all available cognitive resources on the task it's been given top priority.
Even if it means completely missing other information.
Yeah, even salient information that's physically present and visible, it just gets filtered out.
They extend this idea further, right, using that analogy of the pupils being like an energy meter.
Yes, like an electricity meter outside your house,
Yeah.
showing the current rate at which mental energy is being used right now.
And how does that analogy work?
Well, it works on a couple of levels. Just like your electricity use depends on your choices, you decide to turn on a light or a toaster or the AC.
Right.
Your cognitive effort depends on what task you choose to do. You decide to read a dense article or solve a math problem or have a complex conversation.
Okay, you choose the task.
But, and this is key, just like a light bulb or a toaster automatically draws the energy it needs, and no more, assuming the circuit can handle it.
Yeah.
You have limited conscious control over the amount of effort required once you've chosen the task. You can't just force yourself to exert as much effort holding 4 digits in memory for 10 seconds as you must invest to complete the add 3 transformation on those same digits.
Regardless of how motivated you are.
Right. Assuming the task is within your ability, the task itself dictates the minimum necessary effort you have to spend to succeed. You can't just try harder beyond what the past demands, nor can you really slack off below that demand if you want to get it right.
Okay. And both System 2 and electrical circuits have limited capacity, right? That can be overloaded.
They can,
Hmm.
but they respond very differently to overload. An electrical circuit breaker trips when the demand is too high, right? Causing an all-or-nothing failure. Boom, all the devices on that circuit lose power at the same time.
Right. Total shutdown.
Mental overload, the source explains, is much more sophisticated. The response is described as selective and precise.
Yeah.
System 2 doesn't just shut down completely like a tripped breaker.
What does it do instead?
It protects the most important activity, the prioritized one.
Ah.
It makes sure the priority task gets the lion's share, sometimes all, of the attention and cognitive resources it needs to succeed. Even if that means pulling those resources away from everything else. Any spare capacity is then allocated second by second to other ongoing tasks, but only if there is any spare capacity available.
Which connects perfectly back to their add one letter K experiment.
Exactly. Participants were explicitly told,
Yeah.
digit task has priority.
And they followed that instruction.
The proof is that the timing of when the visual target letter K appeared had basically no effect on their performance on the main add one digit task. They protected the priority tasks successfully.
And the result was?
If the critical letter K appeared at a time of peak demand for the digit task, when all resources were focused, their subject simply did not see it. Detection was better only when the transformation task was less demanding, meaning there was some spare capacity left over that could be allocated to the secondary task of looking for the K.
It's such a powerful demonstration of how limited our mental energy is and how carefully it gets allocated.
It really is. And this sophisticated prioritized allocation of attention, it's not just a modern human thing. The source attributes its roots to a long evolutionary history.
Survival related.
Yeah. The ability to orient quickly and focus intently on potential threats or maybe opportunities improves survival across many species. It's certainly not unique to humans.
Right.
And in moments of true emergency, System 1 often takes over completely, assigning total priority to immediate self-protective actions, overriding that slower System 2 deliberation.
Like reacting to a car skidding on ice.
Perfect example. Your body has often already made corrective steering and braking adjustments before your conscious System 2 has even fully registered exactly what's happening. System 1 acts instantly, allocating everything to survival.
Okay. These insights into effort, overload, prioritization, they're really powerful. And they link directly to another fundamental principle the source talks about, the impact of skill and talent, and this overarching law of least effort.
That's right. A really consistent finding in cognitive science, supported by this pupil research and other studies like brain imaging, is that as you become skilled in a task,
It gets easier, requires less effort.
exactly, the demand for cognitive energy to perform it diminishes significantly.
Hmm.
Brain studies actually show that as a task becomes automatic through practice, the pattern of brain activity changes, becomes more efficient, involves fewer brain regions than when you were first learning it.
And talent makes a difference too.
Similar effect, yeah. The source notes that highly intelligent individuals often need less effort to solve the same problems compared to those with average intelligence. This showed up in their pupil dilation research, too.
How?
More talented individuals showed smaller pupil dilations for tasks of the same objective difficulty, suggesting they were performing them more efficiently using less cognitive fuel.
Okay. Which leads to this very general fundamental principle, the law of least effort.
Yes, and it applies to both cognitive and physical exertion. The law basically states that if there are multiple ways to achieve the same goal, people and animals too will eventually gravitate towards the course of action that requires the least amount of effort.
We're wired to be efficient, or maybe just lazy.
Well, the source calls it the economy of action. Effort is considered a cost, and we naturally seem to minimize costs, whether that's physical energy, time, or mental effort.
So acquiring skill isn't just about getting better, it's also about making things less costly, less effortful.
Exactly. Getting really good at something makes it less effortful, less costly in terms of mental energy. And that makes us more likely to choose that skilled, effortless path in the future. It's driven by this balance of benefits, achieving the goal, and costs the effort needed.
And the source puts it pretty bluntly, doesn't it?
It does, with a touch of why observation. Laziness is built deep into our nature.
But again, not as a moral judgment.
Right. More as a description of a fundamental optimization principle in our cognitive system. We are just wired to conserve our valuable, limited resource effort whenever possible.
Which is a powerful explanation for why we like familiar routines, why habits are so incredibly strong and hard to break.
Absolutely. They represent paths that require minimal System 2 intervention, minimal effort. Habits and skilled performance are really System 1's triumph, freeing up System 2 for the stuff only it can handle.
Okay. And thinking about this efficiency and the variable cost of different tasks, their pupil research allowed them to actually place various cognitive activities onto a kind of spectrum of effort, right? Mapping the landscape of mental work.
Yeah, they established a baseline state for subjects just sitting there, awake and aware, but not doing a specific task, which likely already involves some level of arousal compared to being totally relaxed.
So not zero effort, but a baseline.
Right. Then they measured pupil responses during different activities. Tasks needing minuscule effort causing pupil dilation, only about 5% of the increase seen during that intense add 3 task.
Yeah. What were those?
Things like holding just 1 or 2 digits in memory, or associating a simple word with a digit, like remembering 3 means door, barely more demanding than the baseline.
Okay. What about slightly harder?
Discriminating between the pitch of 2 tones, a simple perceptual judgment caused significantly larger dilations than just holding a couple of digits,
Interesting.
inhibiting the tendency to read distracting words, like in a classic Stroop task.
Where the word BLUE is printed in red ink and you have to say red.
Exactly. That induced moderate but clear effort, as System 2 had to fight System 1's automatic reading impulse.
Okay. More effortful still.
Test of short-term memory for 6 or 7 digits required more active rehearsal and storage capacity than shorter strings.
Makes sense.
And surprisingly, even tasks requiring brief but significant effort, like recalling and saying aloud your own phone number, or maybe your spouse's birthday.
Wait, why is recalling your own phone number effortful? It's automatic, isn't it?
Well, the information itself is well known, yes, but the process of quickly accessing it, holding the entire string in memory while organizing the response, may be under a slight implicit time pressure
Okay.
that caused noticeable pupil dilation. It's like a quick mental jog.
Huh, okay. And then you're the absolute limit of capacity. Sprints.
That's where you find mental multiplication of 2-digit numbers, and of course the add 3 task. Those consistently push people to their maximum observed effort levels.
Thinking about that spectrum, where do typical tasks in your own daily life fall? Is your routine mostly those comfortable strolls and moderate jogs?
With only occasional demands that really approach a true sprint. This research gives us this concrete physiological scale to evaluate the cognitive demands we face every day, and maybe understand why some days just feel more draining than others.
Yeah. Which brings us back to those big fundamental questions the source tackles. Like, what exactly makes some mental operations more demanding? What kind of outcomes specifically require that currency of attention and effort that System 2 provides?
And most importantly, what can System 2 do that the automatic, effortless System 1 simply cannot? What are its unique capabilities?
Right. So what are the answers?
Well, the tentative answers for the source suggest that effort is required primarily when the task demands that you simultaneously maintain several distinct ideas in your working memory. Ideas that either require separate actions or need to be combined together according to a specific rule or requirement.
Okay, several distinct ideas needing combination or separate actions.
Exactly. System 1 is great at processing information about one thing, integrating it into a coherent whole. But it struggles when multiple separate elements need to be held and manipulated consciously at the same time.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. The source mentions things like rehearsing a shopping list of distinct items while also entering the store and looking for a basket. That requires holding multiple separate ideas.
Okay.
Or choosing between fish and veal on a menu. That requires comparing distinct attributes of each option, price, preparation, your preference, etc.
Right, multiple attributes, multiple items.
Or combining a surprising survey result with the crucial but separate piece of information that the sample size for the survey was very small. That requires holding the result and the sample size fact and combining them using statistical rules to moderate your conclusion. System 1 might just react to the surprising result alone.
Okay. So this leads to a really clear statement in the source about what System 2 can do exclusively.
Yes. System 2 is the only one of the 2 systems that is capable of explicitly following rules, comparing objects on several attributes simultaneously, and making deliberate choices between multiple distinct options based on those comparisons and rules.
And System 1 just can't do that.
Nope. System 1 is fantastic at detecting simple relations and patterns automatically, seeing that they are all alike, or noticing that the son is much taller than the father. Quick, intuitive judgments.
Okay.
It excels at integrating various pieces of information about one thing to form a coherent impression, like forming an opinion about a person or a situation based on lots of subtle cues.
But it can't handle multiple distinct topics needing separate processing.
Not simultaneously, no. And it's not good at using purely statistical information, which requires combining abstract concepts like a base rate, specific evidence, according to formal
The
rules.
source uses that librarian example, right, to make this super clear.
Exactly. If you're given a description of someone as, say, meek and tidy with a passion for detail,
Yeah.
System 1 will automatically detect that this description strongly resembles a caricature, a stereotype, of a librarian, based on associations you hold. That's a quick, intuitive pattern match. Resemblance.
Okay, System 1 says librarian.
Right. But only System 2, if it has the necessary knowledge about population statistics and knows how to apply it, can combine that strong intuition from System 1 with the statistical knowledge that the actual number of librarians in the population is relatively small compared to, say, salespeople or farmers.
Ah, the base rate.
Exactly. System 1 gives you the compelling but potentially misleading stereotype based purely on resemblance. System 2 provides the capacity for logical, statistical reasoning that can override that intuition, but only if you engage the effort to do so.
That's a fantastic distinction. It gives us a powerful way to recognize when a task demands System 2 effort. When you need to follow complex instructions precisely or compare different things based on multiple criteria, not just a gut feeling.
Or integrate distinct pieces of information logically using rules rather than just blending them into a single overall impression.
It's really the core difference between automatic pattern recognition and deliberate analytical thought.
What did I say?
And another crucial, effortful capability tied specifically to System 2 is its ability to adopt task sets. What does that mean?
Task sets. It basically means consciously programming your memory and attention to obey specific instructions or rules that might override your normal, more habitual responses or ways of seeing the world.
Okay, like the example in the source, counting Fs.
Exactly, the instruction. Count all occurrences of the letter F on this page. This isn't a task your brain does automatically. You don't naturally walk around counting Fs.
No, definitely not.
So your System 2 has to consciously take on this specific artificial rule. It has to create a mental filter for it and then apply it systematically as you scan the page.
And the source notes that this process is effortful, both setting it up and doing it.
Yes. Effortful to establish that specific F-counting filter or task set in the first place, and effortful to carry it out consistently. Although naturally, practice on that specific task would make it less effortful over time, following that law of least effort again.
Okay. And psychologists have a term for this.
They do. Executive control. It covers adopting, maintaining, and also terminating these effortful task sets when they're no longer needed.
And neuroscientists have linked this to specific brain areas.
Yes, particularly areas involved in resolving conflict between competing responses and significantly areas in the prefrontal cortex, which are strongly associated with higher human intelligence.
Okay. And the effort involved in managing these task sets becomes even clearer when you have to switch between them, right?
Absolutely. The source describes a follow-up task. Immediately after counting Fs on one page, you're instructed. Now count all the commas in the next page.
And that's harder. Why?
It's harder precisely because you've just built up this strong, effortful tendency to focus on and identify Fs. Now you have to consciously, deliberately override that newly acquired mental filter and switch your attention and rules to focus on commas instead. There's a real mental switching cost that requires effort.
Okay, that makes sense. This need for rapid, effortful switching between tasks, that's a key finding in cognitive psychology.
Yes, especially when it happens under time pressure, when you don't have the luxury of slowly reorienting yourself to the new task.
And this requirement for rapid switching, that's a big reason why tasks like add 3 and complex mental multiplication are so incredibly difficult.
Exactly. You're constantly juggling things, holding original digits, applying operations like +3, holding intermediate results, switching between different stages of processing input, transformation, storage, output, all within your limited working memory, all under time pressure. It's this continuous juggling act that demands constant, effortful executive control.
And modern tests designed to measure working memory often involve this kind of switching.
They do. They often require switching between demanding tasks, maybe holding results from one while performing operations on another. And performance on these complex working memory tests correlates pretty well with measures of general intelligence.
Okay, but the source makes a crucial point here, right? That this ability to control attention, to switch tasks efficiently, it isn't just the same thing as intelligence.
Exactly. That's a key takeaway. Measures of efficiency in controlling attention and switching between tasks actually predict real-world performance in incredibly high-stakes jobs,
Like what?
like air traffic controllers, pilots. And they predict performance beyond the predictive power of standard intelligence tests alone. So this ability to direct and manage your mental resources effectively, especially under pressure, seems to be its own distinct and incredibly valuable skill.
That makes so much sense. Thinking about how tiring it feels to constantly juggle different projects at work, switching between emails, messages, meetings, then trying to dive back into deep, focused work.
Yeah.
This research helps explain why that feels so draining. You're constantly paying that mental cost of switching task sets, reorienting your attention, changing your mental rules.
Absolutely. And time pressure is another huge driver of cognitive effort, closely linked to that working memory load and the need for rapid processing we just talked about.
The metronome in the add one or add three tasks.
Right, or just the natural decay rate of unprocessed information in your working memory. It forces a pace that demands effort.
Like the image the source uses the juggler with several balls in the air.
Exactly. If you have multiple pieces of information you need to hold and manipulate simultaneously, you cannot afford to slow down. You have to keep actively refreshing and rehearsing that information or doing operations on it before it just fades from your working memory.
So any task requiring you to keep several distinct ideas or goals in mind at the same time will have this sort of hurried character.
Yes, demanding continuous effort just to keep everything active, organized, and prevent it from decaying in memory.
And the source notes that unless you happen to have a naturally capacious working memory,
A larger capacity for holding and manipulating information.
you might be forced to work uncomfortably hard, putting in significant effort just to keep up with tasks that other people might find less demanding.
It's true, and it bears repeating. The most effortful forms of slow thinking, that deliberate analytical system 2 stuff, are paradoxically often those that require you to think fast.
Because you're juggling multiple elements under time constraints. Whether that pressure is external, like a deadline, or internal, like memory decay.
Right. Even if you think for a living, the source suggests, few daily mental tasks are actually as demanding as that add 3 sprint, or even just storing and actively maintaining 6 or 7 digits for recall without any transformation.
Which explains why we normally avoid pushing ourselves to that limit all the time. Our default strategy to cope with potential mental overload
Is to follow the law of least effort.
we break down tasks into smaller, easier steps whenever we can.
Right, and we commit intermediate results to external storage. We write things down, save files, use reminders, rather than relying solely on our easily overloaded working memory.
We conduct our mental lives primarily by this law of least effort. It's an efficiency principle.
But it also means we often operate well below our maximum possible cognitive capacity for deliberate, effortful thinking, simply because it's less demanding to do so.
Okay. These powerful ideas from the source, they really translate directly into how we can understand and maybe talk about our own thinking processes and even the behavior of others in everyday life.
Definitely. You can almost hear it in the way people describe their mental state, maybe without realizing the cognitive science behind it. Like someone saying, "Whoa, I won't try to solve this complex problem while I'm driving right now."
Yeah.
This feels like a pupil-dilating task. It requires way too much mental effort, and I need my full attention for the road. They're acknowledging the cognitive load and correctly prioritizing driving safety.
Right. Or maybe interpreting someone's apparent lack of engagement, not just as laziness, but through that lens of effort conservation.
Exactly. The law of least effort is definitely operating here. He's taking the simplest route. He'll think as little as is absolutely necessary to get this done. It's an observation about efficiency.
Or explaining seemingly careless mistakes or oversights. Maybe not as carelessness, but due to cognitive overload.
Yeah, she didn't forget about the meeting because it wasn't important to her. She was completely focused, in a state of high cognitive load, on something else demanding all her System 2 effort when the meeting details were mentioned.
And she simply didn't hear or register you. It was a moment of effortful blindness caused by her focus.
Exactly. Or explicitly distinguishing between those quick intuitive judgments and more deliberate thought.
Like saying, okay, what came quickly to my mind first was an intuition from System 1, probably based on resemblance or some association.
I'll have to consciously override that, start over, and search my memory deliberately or analyze the data more carefully to get the real System 2 answer.
Try spotting these principles, the pull of least effort, the signs of cognitive load. Those moments, System 2 has to step in and override System 1. Try spotting them at action in your own day.
It really does give you a new vocabulary, a deeper understanding of why your brain feels the way it does when it's working hard or why it prefers not to sometimes.
It absolutely reframes those moments of mental strain, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Okay, so to recap this deep dive into attention and effort, we've unpacked that fundamental distinction between the automatic, intuitive System 1 and the effortful, lazy System 2.
Right.
We discovered that surprisingly effective method of measuring internal mental effort through the visible physiological response of pupil dilation.
And map that characteristic inverted V pattern of effort, building up and then releasing over time.
Yeah. We explored the concepts of cognitive overload and how System 2 responds with that sophisticated selective prioritization, which can sometimes lead to effortful blindness.
Hmm.
We looked at the fundamental law of least effort that drives us to conserve our mental energy and how skill and talent make tasks less effortful.
We detailed System 2's unique abilities specifically. Its requirement to engage when you need to simultaneously maintain multiple distinct ideas or follow explicit rules.
And finally, we saw how tasks requiring rapid switching between mental rules or operating under time pressure significantly increase cognitive effort, pushing us toward those rare sprint states.
Understanding these concepts, drawn from this really fascinating source material, it gives us such a powerful new perspective on why certain tasks feel inherently harder than others,
Yeah.
why we might miss information or make errors when we're intensely focused on something else,
Right.
and the profound importance of managing our cognitive load, whether that's through, strategically taking breaks, structuring complex tasks into smaller steps, or just minimizing distractions in our environment. It helps us appreciate the real cost of deliberate thought.
It really does. And based on the source's fascinating observation that even people who engage in complex thinking for a living rarely push their System 2 as hard in daily life as they were pushed by simple lab tasks like add 3.
Yeah, that's a striking point.
It leaves us with this provocative thought, maybe. If the tasks that truly demand our maximum cognitive effort that force us into that Sister 2 sprint are actually so uncommon in our typical daily routines, does that fundamental law of least effort keep us in a perpetual stroll or jog comfortably below our potential?
Hmm.
What opportunities for deeper, more effortful, more truly System 2 thinking might we be missing simply because our inherent nature steers us towards the path of least cognitive resistance?
That's a question that perhaps requires a little System 2 effort itself to ponder fully as you navigate your own cognitive landscape.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the surprisingly visible world of attention and effort.